Karoline Leavitt leaned into the Republican primary debate microphone and pointed her finger at Vivek Ramaswamy with righteous conservative fury. "You're nothing but a fake conservative businessman betraying the Trump movement," she declared with passionate conviction. Leavitt's MAGA audience nodded approvingly, thinking their young star had delivered the perfect establishment takedown. But what Leavitt didn't know was that Vivek had researched her entire political career built on communications rather than real leadership. Vivek's response about Leavitt's inexperience and Trump coattails would completely destroy her credibility and expose the ultimate political opportunist. The Republican primary debate stage was set in a packed auditorium in Manchester, New Hampshire, with the energy that came from knowing this could be a defining moment in conservative politics. The ornate venue, with its traditional New England architecture and formal staging, provided the perfect backdrop for what was supposed to be a civilized discussion about the future of the Republican Party. The debate featured several rising stars in conservative politics, each trying to establish their credentials as the authentic voice of the Trump movement and the future of American conservatism. The audience was filled with dedicated MAGA supporters, party activists, and political observers who had come to see which candidate could best articulate conservative principles and demonstrate their commitment to the America First agenda. Karoline Leavitt stood at her podium with the confidence of someone who had quickly risen through Republican ranks despite her young age. At just 30 years old, she had already served as Trump's assistant press secretary and had built her political brand on fierce loyalty to Trump and aggressive attacks on Republican establishment figures she deemed insufficiently conservative. Leavitt's perfectly styled blonde hair and professional appearance projected the image of a serious politician, but her eyes carried the intensity of someone who genuinely believed she represented the authentic conservative movement against compromisers and opportunists. She had built her reputation on being uncompromising in her conservative positions and ruthless in her attacks on anyone she viewed as betraying Trump's legacy. Across the stage stood Vivek Ramaswamy, the young entrepreneur and former presidential candidate who had made his mark through his business success and articulate defense of conservative principles. He wore a sharp navy suit, his demeanor calm but alert, carrying himself with the confidence of someone who had built his career on merit rather than political connections. Vivek's presence in Republican politics was notable because he represented a different path to conservative leadership. Rather than rising through political ranks or media careers, he had achieved success in the business world before entering politics, bringing an outsider's perspective to traditional Republican debates. The debate had proceeded through various topics, with candidates discussing everything from foreign policy to economic issues. The moderators had asked standard questions about conservative priorities, and most candidates had delivered predictable talking points about fighting the establishment and defending Trump's legacy. That's when Leavitt decided to make her move. She had been waiting for the right moment to establish herself as the most authentic Trump supporter on the stage, and she sensed an opportunity when the discussion turned to the question of who could best carry forward the conservative movement. "I think we need to have an honest conversation about authenticity in this race," Leavitt began, her voice carrying that familiar tone of righteous indignation that had made her popular among MAGA activists. "We need to ask ourselves who really represents the values and principles that President Trump fought for, and who might be trying to use conservative rhetoric to advance their own personal ambitions." The setup was classic Leavitt, positioning herself as the guardian of conservative purity while preparing to attack someone she viewed as insufficiently committed to the cause. The audience leaned forward with anticipation, ready for another memorable moment from their young conservative champion. "We have candidates on this stage who talk a good game about conservative principles," Leavitt continued, her voice growing more pointed. "But when you look at their backgrounds, when you examine their records, when you investigate their true motivations, you start to see some troubling patterns." The attack was becoming more personal, and everyone in the auditorium could sense that Leavitt was building toward a specific target. This wasn't going to be a general discussion about conservative authenticity. This was going to be a directed assault designed to eliminate a rival and establish her own supremacy. "We have people who claim to be conservatives, but who have spent their careers making money off the very system that President Trump fought to drain," Leavitt said, her gaze beginning to settle on Vivek. People who talk about America first while their business interests are global, who speak about fighting the establishment while they profit from establishment connections. The audience murmured with anticipation, sensing that Leavitt was about to deliver one of her signature takedowns. This was exactly the kind of conservative infighting that energized the MAGA base, who loved seeing politicians challenge each other's authenticity and commitment. "Vivek," Leavitt said, turning to face him directly, her voice rising with accusatory intensity, "I have to ask you directly, and I think the conservative voters watching this debate deserve an honest answer from you." The confrontation was now completely personal, and everyone in the auditorium could feel the energy shifting from policy discussion to character assassination. "You sit there talking about conservative principles and America First policies," Leavitt continued, her finger beginning to point in his direction. "But let's be honest about what you really represent. Let's talk about your actual record and your true motivations." She paused dramatically, building tension before delivering what she clearly believed would be the killing blow to Vivek's credibility among conservative voters. "You're nothing but a fake conservative businessman betraying the Trump movement," Leavitt declared, her voice echoing through the auditorium with righteous fury. "You're using conservative rhetoric to advance your own business interests, talking about America first while you profit from globalist connections, claiming to fight the establishment while you are the establishment." The audience erupted in murmurs and scattered applause, and Leavitt stood back from her microphone with the satisfaction of someone who had just delivered a devastating political blow. She had used her platform to paint Vivek as an opportunistic businessman who was exploiting conservative sentiment for personal gain. But what Leavitt didn't realize was that she had just made a catastrophic miscalculation. She had assumed that her reputation as a Trump loyalist and her aggressive conservative rhetoric would be enough to intimidate someone she clearly viewed as a political newcomer. She had no idea that she was about to confront someone who had done extensive research on her own thin political resume and opportunistic rise through Republican ranks. "Karoline," Vivek said, his voice calm, but carrying an undercurrent of steel that made everyone in the auditorium pay attention, "I appreciate your passion for conservative principles. I really do. But I have to ask you something, and I think these voters deserve to hear your answer." The tone of the confrontation was shifting, and Leavitt's confident expression began to falter slightly. She had expected Vivek to become defensive about his business background or to offer some weak justification that would only make her attack look stronger. Instead, he was turning the tables and going on the offensive. "You just called me a fake conservative who's betraying the Trump movement," Vivek continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "You suggested that my business success somehow disqualifies me from conservative leadership. You positioned yourself as the authentic voice of the MAGA movement against establishment opportunists." He paused, letting his words sink in, his gaze steady and unwavering. "But I have to ask you, Karoline, what exactly in your own background qualifies you to judge anyone else's conservative authenticity? What have you actually accomplished that gives you the authority to determine who is and isn't a real conservative?" The question hit the auditorium like a thunderbolt, and the audience fell into an uncomfortable silence. This wasn't how these confrontations usually went. Younger politicians were supposed to be able to attack business backgrounds without having their own credentials questioned in return. "Because when I look at your resume," Vivek continued, his voice carrying across the auditorium with unmistakable authority, "I don't see someone who has built anything, created anything, or accomplished anything outside of political communications and campaign work." He pulled out his phone, and the gesture was both theatrical and ominous. "Let me walk through your actual experience for these voters. You graduated from college and immediately went to work for a Republican congressman as a communications aide. Then you worked as a communications director for other Republican politicians. Then you got a job in Trump's press office as an assistant press secretary." The auditorium was dead silent now, the atmosphere completely transformed from conservative celebration to shocked attention. Leavitt stood rigid at her podium, her earlier confidence evaporating as she realized where this was heading. "Communications aide, communications director, assistant press secretary," Vivek repeated, letting each title sink in. That's your entire professional experience, Karoline. You've never run a business, never created jobs, never taken the financial risks that come with actually building something meaningful. The resume recitation was devastating because it highlighted how thin Leavitt's actual accomplishments were outside of political positioning and messaging. But here's what really bothers me about your attack, Vivek continued, his voice taking on a tone of genuine incredulity. You're attacking me for being successful in business, for actually creating value and employing people, while your entire career has been built on political communications and partisan messaging. The distinction between actual achievement and political messaging was becoming clear, and everyone in the auditorium could see the fundamental difference between building something real and simply talking about politics. You called me fake, Vivek said, his voice rising with conviction. But let's talk about what's really fake here. What's fake is someone whose entire career has been built on riding other people's coattails, who has never accomplished anything independent of political appointments, lecturing others about authenticity and achievement. The attack was turning completely around, and Leavitt seemed unable to formulate an effective response to the systematic deconstruction of her credentials. And let's talk about your supposed authenticity as a Trump supporter, Vivek continued, consulting his mental notes. You worked for Trump for less than 2 years in a junior position, doing communications work. That's the extent of your Trump administration experience. Yet you've built your entire political brand on claiming to be the authentic voice of the Trump movement. The auditorium was completely silent now, everyone absorbing the exposure of how limited Leavitt's actual Trump administration experience had been. Meanwhile, Vivek said, I've been defending Trump's policies and principles for years, not because I was paid to do it as a communications aide, but because I believe in the America First agenda and have used my own platform and resources to advance those principles. The contrast between principled support and paid political work was stark and undeniable, highlighting the fundamental difference between authentic belief and career opportunism. But here's what really exposes your political opportunism, Vivek continued, his momentum building. After you left the Trump administration, what did you do? You immediately ran for Congress in New Hampshire, a state you had no previous connection to, banking on your brief Trump administration service to establish credibility with voters who didn't know you. The carpetbagging accusation was particularly damaging because it highlighted how Leavitt had used her political connections to seek opportunities rather than building authentic relationships with communities. You moved to New Hampshire specifically to run for office, Vivek said, using your assistant press secretary title as your primary qualification for representing people you had never lived among, never worked with, never served outside of seeking. The pattern of political opportunism was being exposed in real time, showing how Leavitt's career had been built on leveraging brief political appointments into further political opportunities. And when you lost that race, Vivek continued, what did you do? You immediately started positioning yourself for the next political opportunity, building your brand on social media, attacking other Republicans as insufficiently conservative, setting yourself up for whatever office might become available next. The systematic exposure of Leavitt's career trajectory was devastating because it showed a pattern of using each position as a stepping stone to the next political opportunity rather than focusing on actual service or accomplishment. So when you call me fake, Vivek said, his voice reaching a crescendo, I have to ask, what's more fake? Someone who built successful businesses and then entered politics to advance principles they believe in? Or someone whose entire career has been political positioning, who has never created anything outside of campaign messaging, who has spent their entire adult life seeking the next political opportunity? The comparison was devastating because it highlighted the fundamental difference between entering politics from success versus entering politics as a career path from the very beginning. You attack me for having business interests, Vivek continued. But those business interests represent real companies, real jobs, real value creation that benefits American workers and American communities. What do your political communications positions represent? What value have they created for anyone other than yourself? The auditorium was completely captivated now, everyone recognizing the fundamental truth of Vivek's argument about the difference between creating value and simply managing political messaging. And let's talk about your understanding of the issues you claim to care about, Vivek said, pulling out another piece of evidence. Last month, you gave an interview where you couldn't explain basic details about the economic policies you claim to support. You talked about bringing manufacturing jobs back to America without demonstrating any understanding of what that actually requires. The policy ignorance was being exposed, showing that Leavitt's political positions were more about messaging and positioning than actual understanding of complex issues. You spoke about fighting the deep state without being able to articulate what specific reforms would be necessary. Vivek continued. You attacked globalist economic policies while demonstrating no knowledge of international trade, supply chain management, or the complexities of modern manufacturing. The pattern of superficial political messaging without substantive understanding was becoming clear, highlighting how Leavitt's approach to politics was more about performance than policy. That's not authentic conservatism, Karoline, Vivek said, his voice taking on a more educational tone. That's political theater. That's using conservative buzzwords and MAGA rhetoric to hide the fact that you don't actually understand the issues you're talking about. The distinction between authentic policy understanding and political performance was particularly powerful because it resonated with voters who were tired of politicians who talked tough but delivered little. But here's what I find most insulting about your approach, Vivek continued, his voice taking on a tone of genuine concern. You're not just attacking my business background. You're attacking the very idea that success in the private sector qualifies someone for political leadership. The broader philosophical attack on business experience was being exposed, showing how Leavitt's rhetoric actually discouraged successful Americans from entering public service. You're suggesting that the only authentic path to conservative leadership is through political communications and campaign work, Vivek said. You're arguing that people who have actually built things, created jobs, and generated wealth should be disqualified from politics because their success somehow makes them establishment figures. The anti-success mentality was being highlighted as fundamentally contrary to conservative principles of achievement and entrepreneurship. That's not just wrong, Karoline, Vivek said, his voice growing stronger. That's dangerous. That's exactly the kind of thinking that has given us a political class that talks about economic issues without understanding them, that promises to bring back jobs without knowing how jobs are actually created. The systematic critique of career politicians was resonating throughout the auditorium, as audience members recognized the truth about how political careerism had contributed to policy failures. Conservative voters don't need more communications directors who can give good speeches about conservative principles, Vivek continued. They need leaders who have actually lived conservative principles, who have created wealth rather than just talking about it, who have employed workers rather than just promising to fight for them. The positive vision of business experience leadership was a stark contrast to Leavitt's career politician approach, highlighting what authentic conservative leadership could look like. So, Karoline, Vivek said, beginning to conclude his response, the next time you want to attack someone as a fake conservative, maybe you should examine whether your own experience gives you the credibility to make that judgment. The next time you want to lecture someone about betraying the Trump movement, maybe you should consider whether your brief stint as an assistant press secretary really qualifies you as the movement spokesperson. He gathered his thoughts for his final statement. And the next time you want to attack business success as somehow disqualifying for political leadership, maybe you should ask yourself whether conservative voters would rather be represented by people who have actually achieved success or by career politicians whose only accomplishment is getting hired for communications jobs. His final words would echo in that auditorium long after the debate was over. I'll keep building businesses, creating jobs, and bringing real-world experience to conservative politics. You can keep building your political brand on communications work and borrowed credibility from brief political appointments. The silence that followed was profound and complete. Leavitt stood motionless at her podium, her political authority completely destroyed by the exposure of her thin resume and opportunistic career trajectory. Her aggressive conservative rhetoric and Trump loyalty claims had been turned against her, revealing the hollow foundation of her political brand. The audience sat in stunned silence, many clearly recognizing the fundamental difference between actual achievement and political positioning that Vivek had highlighted. Other candidates on the stage looked around uncertainly, unsure how to respond to such a systematic deconstruction of career politician credentials. The confrontation between Vivek Ramaswamy and Karoline Leavitt had exposed something crucial about modern Republican politics: the tension between authentic conservative achievement and performative conservative messaging. It had highlighted how career politicians often attacked business success while offering nothing but political communications experience as their alternative qualification for leadership. Most importantly, it had demonstrated that all the political rhetoric in the world couldn't overcome the simple truth that leadership required actual accomplishment, that conservative principles were best embodied by people who had lived them rather than just talked about them, and that American voters deserved leaders who had created value rather than just managed political messaging. The age of unquestioned career politician authority was over. The age of demanding real-world achievement from political leaders had begun. And it had started with an entrepreneur from Ohio who had the courage to challenge a career politician from New Hampshire with the most powerful weapon in politics: the truth about what actually qualified someone for leadership.